The engine's drone was Carter Hayes' shield. The flight was his ritual, and Maverick, his dog, always slept. Until today. The German Shepherd was suddenly on his feet, whining, pressing himself against the cockpit window. He was staring down at an island Carter had passed 100 times, a place of nothing but rock and pine. Carter, annoyed that his sacred silence was broken, banked the plane lower. He was ready to scold the dog. But then he saw it. It was an arrangement that could not be natural. 3 massive letters spelled out in broken logs and boulders screamed silently from the empty beach. An SOS from a place where there was no life. Carter had to choose. Ignore it and keep his peace, or descend into that dead zone and face whatever or whoever had created them. We invite you to support us by subscribing to the channel. The drone of the Lycoming engine was the only constant. It was a deep, resonating thrum that vibrated through the metal frame of the 1975 Cessna 185, through the pedals beneath Carter's boots, and up into his very bones. For Carter Hayes, this sound was not noise, it was a shield. It was the wall he built around himself, 3,000 feet above the cold, jagged coast of Maine. Carter glanced at the instruments, his eyes scanning the dials with a discipline that had been ingrained in him decades ago. Altitude steady, airspeed steady, fuel, oil pressure. All was in order. He was a man of 45, but the reflection staring back from the dark glass of the altimeter looked older. His face was a map of hard miles, weathered by wind and sun, and carved with lines that spoke of a life lived outdoors, and of a past that refused to stay buried. His brown hair, too long and unruly, was silvered at the temples, tucked back beneath the headset. This was his ritual. 3 times a week, as long as the notoriously fickle Maine weather allowed, he would fly. He would leave his small, isolated cabin on the coast, unlock the tie-downs on his old float plane, and climb into the sky. This was not for pleasure. It was not for the joy of flight, though he had felt that once, a lifetime ago. Now it was maintenance. It was a disciplined route, a precise grid. He flew over the empty stretches of forest and the vast gray expanse of the Atlantic. The sky was a beautiful, empty prison, and he was its willing inmate. The constant, deafening roar of the engine was a blessing, a physical barrier of sound that was loud enough, just barely, to drown out the echoes. The echoes were always waiting. They waited in the silence of his cabin, in the pause between waves crashing on his beach, in the dead of night. They were the sounds of shouting in a language he still understood, the sharp metallic sounds of equipment, the final choked cry of his friend Adrian. The ritual, the flight, the engine's drone was the only thing that kept the ghosts at bay. Beside him, in the co-pilot's seat, his only companion stirred. His name was Maverick. He was a 6-year-old German Shepherd, a magnificent animal of gray and white, with intelligent amber eyes that missed nothing. He was not a pet. He was a partner, the only living soul Carter allowed into his tightly controlled world. Maverick was Carter's anchor, his early warning system. The dog understood the geography of Carter's trauma better than any human could, sensing the tremors of a memory long before it breached the surface. Now Maverick was calm, his head resting on his paws, his gaze fixed forward. He was accustomed to the flight, accustomed to the noise. He was part of the ritual. Carter reached over, his gloved hand finding the dog's head, scratching behind the alert, upright ears. "Just us, Mav," Carter murmured, though his voice was lost in the engine's roar. They flew on, the gray water stretching to a gray horizon. They passed over small, uninhabited islands, lumps of dark granite and dense pine that looked like forgotten fragments of the world. Carter checked his watch. Another 15 minutes, and he could turn back, the ritual complete. He could land, tie down the plane, and retreat to the safety of his cabin before the sun began to dip. Then the ritual broke. It started not with a sound, but with a feeling. A shift in the cabin. Maverick lifted his head, his ears swiveling. A low, anxious whine, barely audible over the engine, vibrated in the dog's throat. Carter's hand, resting on the yoke, tensed. He glanced at the dog. "What is it?" Maverick stood up as much as the seatbelt harness would allow, placing his front paws on the dashboard. His claws made a light tapping sound against the plastic. He was not looking at Carter. His gaze was locked on the ocean below, specifically on a dark shape that was growing larger. Moose Call Island, a desolate, windswept rock pile that was known only to lobstermen and gulls. "It's nothing, Mav, just rocks." But Maverick grew more insistent. The whine grew higher in pitch, a sound of genuine distress. He pushed his wet nose against the windscreen, his body trembling slightly. Carter felt a hot spike of annoyance. This was not part of the ritual. The ritual was smooth, predictable, and empty. This was a complication. He scanned the water around the island. A submerged rock? A stranded seal? He banked the old Cessna, the wing dipping, giving him a clear view of the island. It was just as he remembered, sheer cliffs on three sides and a small crescent-shaped beach on the leeward side, choked with driftwood and seaweed. He almost missed it, just a tangle of dark lines on the gray sand. Carter squinted. He circled lower, the engine's pitch changing as he eased back the throttle. The plane descended, and the lines resolved into three distinct shapes. SOS Carter stared, his mind refusing to process the image for a full second. The letters were huge, spelled out in dark stones and massive pieces of driftwood, stark against the sand. His first reaction was not compassion, it was a deep, sudden anger, an intrusion. This was his sky, his empty sanctuary, and someone had dragged the messy, desperate problems of the world into it. People. A complication. His instinct, sharp and immediate, was to pull back on the yoke, climb to his cruising altitude, and fly on. He had left that world behind. He was not a rescuer. He was not a soldier, not anymore. He was just a man trying to survive his own memories. He had nothing left to give, and he did not want to be involved. He had seen where involvement led. It led to men like Adrian dying in the dust. He leveled the plane, his jaw set, his eyes fixed on the horizon, away from the island. But Maverick would not allow it. The dog began to bark, a sharp, frantic sound that cut through the engine's drone. He pawed at the dashboard, then turned his head, fixing Carter with a look of such unwavering certainty, such desperate pleading, that Carter's resolve fractured. The dog knew. He always knew. Carter looked from the dog back to the desperate signal on the sand. The letters looked small, pathetic, and terrifyingly real. He sighed, a long, ragged breath that seemed to come from the deepest, most tired part of him. The annoyance faded, replaced by a cold, familiar resignation. He trusted Maverick's instincts more than his own. The dog was his true north, the only part of the world that had never lied to him, never failed him. If Maverick said there was trouble, there was trouble. "All right," Carter said, his voice a gravelly rumble. He clicked the button on his headset's microphone, though he knew he was talking only to the dog. "All right, Mav, we'll look." He banked the plane sharply, the engine groaning in protest as he cut the throttle further, lining up with the small, sheltered cove. He lowered the flaps. The ritual was broken. The world, with all its noise and all its pain, had found him. Carter Hayes and his dog Maverick were descending. The world dissolved from a loud, vibrating blur into a spray of white water. Carter cut the engine, and the sudden, profound silence was more shocking than the engine's roar had ever been. The deep thrum that had been his shield for the past hour was gone, and in its place, silence. A thick, heavy, unnatural quiet that seemed to press in on the thin metal skin of the Cessna. The only sound was the gentle, rhythmic lapping of water against the aluminum floats. Carter sat for a long moment, the quiet ringing in his ears. It felt wrong. It felt exposed. Maverick, no longer whining, stood on the co-pilot's seat, his body rigid, his amber eyes fixed on the gray beach, just 50 yards away. "Okay," Carter said, his own voice sounding loud and rusty. He unbuckled his seatbelt. He moved with an economy of motion that was born of long habit. From behind his seat, He pulled his old brown leather flight jacket. It was worn smooth in places, the leather creased and dark, smelling faintly of oil and the cold sea air. It was an old friend, a piece of armor. He shrugged it on. Beneath it, holstered on his belt, was his Sig Sauer P226. He never flew without it. He checked that the weapon was secure, his hand brushing against the cold steel. Next, he reached for Maverick's harness. It was a professional-grade tactical harness, not a civilian leash. Carter's hands moved deftly, clicking the buckles into place over the dog's powerful shoulders. Maverick stood perfectly still, accepting the gear. He knew this too. This was work. Carter grabbed a small waterproof dry bag, checked the contents, a compact first aid kit, a satellite phone, a length of rope, a flashlight, and slung it over his shoulder. He opened the cabin door, the hinges making a small protesting sound. The salt air hit him, cold and damp. He stepped out onto the float, his boots making a hollow sound on the metal. He tied the plane's rope to a large, half-submerged rock, securing the knot with practiced efficiency. Maverick followed, moving balanced and low, jumping from the float to the shallow water with a quiet splash. They waded the last few feet to the beach. The sand was coarse, littered with broken shells and thick strands of dark seaweed. The SOS was even more disturbing up close. The stones were large, the driftwood logs heavy. It had taken time and desperation to build this. Carter scanned the beach, his gaze moving in short, precise arcs. Left, right, up to the tree line. Nothing. No movement. The island was eerily still. The wind that had buffeted the plane at 1,000 feet was absent here, blocked by the towering granite cliffs that ringed the small cove. Maverick, however, was already working. He didn't run. He didn't bark. His nose was to the ground, his plumed tail low and steady. He ignored the SOS sign entirely, moving past it toward the only break in the dense, dark forest of spruce and pine, a narrow opening that looked like a game trail. "What do you got, Mav?" Carter murmured. Maverick moved forward, his paws making no sound on the damp sand. He reached the mouth of the trail and stopped. He didn't look back. His entire body went rigid. A low, almost inaudible sound rumbled in his chest. It was not a bark, not a warning, but a deep, controlled growl. Carter's hand moved from his side to the grip of his handgun, his thumb finding the strap. He walked slowly, closing the distance to the dog, his eyes scanning the dark woods in front of them. "Easy, boy." He reached Maverick's side and saw what the dog had found. It was lying just to the side of the trail, half hidden by a clump of tall, wild grass and a patch of disturbed leaves, as if someone had kicked it there by accident. It was a hunting knife, a large one with a dark composite handle and a wide blade. The blade was caked in dark, reddish-brown. It was not fresh, not wet, but it was not old either. It was recent. A few days, maybe. This was violence. The switch in Carter's mind was instantaneous. The annoyance, the reluctance, the weariness, all of it evaporated. The cold resignation was replaced by an even colder clarity. The ghosts of his past, the ones he flew to escape, were not hindrances now. They were his tools. The soldier he had tried to bury took over. His first thought was not of the victim. His first thought was procedure, threat assessment. He did not touch the knife. He did not step into the woods. He looked at Maverick. "Back," he commanded, his voice a low, sharp whisper. Maverick instantly obeyed, backing away from the trail, his eyes still fixed on the dark opening. Carter backed up with him, his hand remaining on his weapon, his gaze never leaving the tree line. He moved quickly, but not running, back across the sand, his boots crunching on the shells, back to the water's edge, back to the plane. He climbed onto the float, Maverick jumping up beside him. Carter slid into the cockpit, his heart now hammering, not with fear, but with a sudden, surging adrenaline. This was a tactical situation, and the first rule was communications. He grabbed the comms radio handset. "Mayday, mayday, mayday," he said, his voice level. "This is Cessna November 5185 Kilo on the coast of Moose Call Island. I have found evidence of a violent encounter and a distress signal, requesting immediate assistance." He let go of the button. The only reply was a loud, empty hiss. Static. He tried again. Channel 16, the emergency frequency. Mayday, Mayday. Any station, this is Cessna 85 Kilo. Do you copy? Static. His stomach tightened. He flipped the switch for the main comms radio, dialing in the frequency for the nearest Coast Guard station in Bar Harbor. Static. Just a wall of empty noise. He grabbed the dry bag, his fingers fumbling for a moment with the clip. He pulled out the satellite phone, a heavy, rugged piece of equipment he kept for emergencies, just like this. He flipped the cover and powered it on. The screen lit up. Searching for network, Carter held his breath, watching the small icon. The icon flashed, then turned into a single, stark message. No signal. He stared at it. He moved the phone around the cockpit, holding it up to the windscreen. Nothing. The message remained. No, he whispered. He understood, with a sinking, sickening realization. The island. It wasn't just a physical fortress. The towering granite cliffs that surrounded the cove, the ones that blocked the wind, were also blocking everything else. They had formed a perfect cup, a dead zone. He was as cut off from the world as the person who had written SOS. He sat back in his seat, the silence of the cockpit once again pressing in. He looked at the woods. He looked at his silent radios. He had two choices. He could start the engine, take off, and fly back to the mainland. It would take him 30 minutes to get high enough to get a signal, maybe an hour before he could get back with help. An hour. He thought of the blood on the knife. An hour could be an eternity. He thought of Adrian bleeding out in the dust and the helicopters that had arrived just 5 minutes too late. Or he could stay. He looked at Maverick. The dog was no longer looking at the trail. He was looking at Carter. His gaze was steady, patient. He was waiting. Waiting for the command. Waiting for his partner to make the choice he already knew he would make. Carter scrubbed a hand over his face, the rough stubble on his jaw scratching his palm. The intrusion was no longer an annoyance. It was a duty, a failed communication check, a missing partner. This was a mission, whether he wanted it to be or not. He let out a long, slow exhale. The resignation returned, but this time it was different. It was heavy, but it was solid. It was purpose. "All right, Mav," Carter said, his voice quiet but firm. He clipped the sat phone back to his belt, its useless screen dark. "We're on our own." He picked up the dry bag, stepped out onto the float, and with his dog at his side, waded back to the island. Carter gave the command with a simple, downward gesture of his left hand. "Lead on." Maverick, needing no other cue, turned from the beach and entered the dark opening to the trail. The dog moved in a way Carter had seen 1,000 times in training, but never for real. He was no longer a companion, he was a tool, a living sensor array. He moved low, his body a silent gray-white shadow, placing each paw with deliberate care, his nose constantly testing the air, his ears swiveling, catching the slightest disturbance. Carter followed, his own movements an echo of the dog's. He fell into the rhythm that had been drilled into him at Fort Bragg. His boots, which had crunched heavily on the beach's shells, were now silent on the soft, pine-needle-covered earth. He moved in a crouch, his senses exploding outward. The forest was dense, far darker than the open beach. The air was heavy, damp, and smelled of salt, decaying pine, and the sharp metallic tang of the nearby ocean. The silence was absolute. There were no birds, no squirrels. The only sound was the faint, distant rhythm of the waves lapping the shore behind them, and the sound of his own controlled breathing. He kept his eyes on Maverick, watching the subtle shifts in the dog's body. They moved inland, perhaps 50 yards. The trail was narrow, hemmed in on both sides by thick walls of spruce and fir. Carter felt the oppressive weight of the cliffs above him, the same granite that had blocked his radio signal. He was in a stone cup, a trap. Maverick stopped. Carter stopped instantly, his hand moving from his belt to the grip of his Sig Sauer, his body disappearing behind the trunk of a massive pine. He waited. Maverick didn't growl. He simply stood, his head raised slightly, sniffing the air. He took one more step, then looked back at Carter, a clear, intelligent glance. He was signaling. Carter moved up, flanking the dog. He peered around the tree. The forest opened up into a small, natural clearing, perhaps 30 feet across. It was a pocket of human presence in the deep wild, and it was wrong. Everything about it was wrong. It was a campsite, but it looked as if it had been struck by a sudden, violent wind. In the center was a small, cold fire pit, just a circle of stones filled with damp, dark ash. Beside it, an aluminum kettle lay on its side, a dark stain spreading into the dirt beneath it. A small blue dome tent was set up near the back, but it was partially collapsed, the rainfly flapping loosely from one side. It was the mess, the scattering of personal items, that told the story of panic. A pair of women's hiking boots, high quality, scuffed, were kicked over near the tent's entrance, as if their owner had been pulled from them or had scrambled out in a desperate hurry. A bright yellow rain poncho was snagged on a nearby bush, fluttering like a flag of surrender. A single overturned enamel mug, a waterproof bag, its contents, a map, a compass, a bag of trail mix, spilled onto the ground. It all screamed hastily abandoned. "Clear," Carter whispered, more to himself than the dog. He gave Maverick a signal for watch. Maverick instantly understood. The dog moved to the center of the clearing, near the fire pit. He did not sniff the ground. He did not investigate the tent. He faced the dark woods on the opposite side of the camp, the direction they had not yet explored. He stood perfectly still, a gray and white sentinel, his body tense, his ears erect, guarding Carter's back. Carter trusted the dog completely. He holstered his weapon, but kept his hand on the grip. He began his own, methodical search. He moved to the tent. The zipper was torn, the fabric ripped away from the track. He pulled the flap aside. Empty. 2 sleeping bags were unrolled inside, one blue, one green. A backpack was overturned, its contents just like the ones outside. It was a scene of sudden, complete interruption. He stepped back, his eyes scanning the perimeter. What had happened here? The blood on the knife? Had the person who used it come here? Or had they been taken from here? His gaze fell on a log that had been dragged near the fire pit, clearly used as a bench. The yellow poncho he had seen snagged on the bush was partially draped over it. Something was underneath. He lifted the damp, slick fabric. It was a book, a journal, bound in dark, simple leather. It was soaked through on one side, the cover warped and stiff. A simple leather strap held it closed. Carter felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. This was the voice. This was the answer. He looked at Maverick. The dog had not moved. He was a statue of perfect, alert stillness. Carter moved to the edge of the clearing, settling against a large, moss-covered boulder. The rock was cold and hard against his back, but it gave him a solid position. He could see the whole camp, the trail they had come from, and he could see Maverick. He balanced his sidearm on his knee, his hand resting on it. With his other hand, he worked the stiff leather strap of the journal. It came free with a small, sucking sound. He opened the book. The first few pages were stiff, the paper warped. The ink, a dark blue, had blurred in places from the damp, but it was legible. The handwriting was a strong, clear, feminine script. The first page was just a name. This journal belongs to Dolores. Carter felt a jolt. A name, not just a sign, not just a victim. Dolores? He skipped the first few entries. They were dated, written from Bar Harbor. They were cheerful, sailing with Evan. The weather is perfect. He's so happy. Carter's thumb moved faster, the pages making a soft, damp ripping sound. He was looking for the change. And he found it. The handwriting changed. It was no longer neat. It was rushed, sprawling, the letters pressed hard into the paper. Storm. Came out of nowhere. Rogue wave. The boat. It's gone. Evan is hurt. His leg. We swam. Made it to a beach. An island. Just rocks and trees. We're alive. Carter read on, his pulse a low drum in his ears. He found the entry that mattered. It was dated simply. Day 3. Evan's fever is concerning. I cleaned the wound, but it's bad. I'm scared. But we did something good. We finished the SOS sign on the beach, used the big rocks from the cliff and all the heavy driftwood. It's big. It has to be. Someone has to see it. Someone has to fly over, please. Someone see it. Carter closed the journal, his hand tightening on the cover. Dolores, Evan, they were real. He looked up from the page, the desperate hope in her words hanging in the dead, silent air of the camp. He looked at the overturned kettle, at the abandoned boots, at the cold, empty fire pit, and then his gaze went to the trail he had just walked, to the spot where the bloody knife had lain. They had been alive. They had been here, hoping to be saved. Carter looked at Maverick. The dog was still watching the woods, unblinking. He knew what Carter now knew. They were not alone, and the people who wrote this journal had not simply left. Carter's hand was numb from the cold. He had been sitting against the boulder for several minutes, the open journal in his lap. The silence of the camp was a physical weight. He looked up, his eyes scanning the clearing. Maverick had not moved. The German shepherd stood like a gray-white statue near the cold fire pit, his head and tail perfectly level, his entire being focused on the dark, opposing trail. The dog's discipline was a silent reassurance, the only thing grounding Carter in the present. He looked back down at the journal. Dolores. Her name felt heavy on his mind. He had read the SOS entry, but there were more pages. He turned the damp, warped paper. The neat, hopeful script of the first days began to fray. Day 4. Evan is worse. The fever won't break. I did my best to clean the wound on his leg again, the one from the boat, but it's angry. Red and angry. He's talking, but not to me. He's talking about home. I keep scanning the horizon. Nothing, just water. I have to stay strong. He needs me. Carter's own breath felt thin. He knew this. He knew this kind of slow, creeping dread. It was worse than a firefight. It was the dread of the inevitable, the slow decay of hope. He turned the page. Day 6. I'm so tired. The cold. It gets in everywhere. Even the fire doesn't seem to work right. Evan didn't eat this morning. He just stares. I read to him from the one book we saved, but I don't think he hears me. I'm scared the SOS isn't big enough. What if they can't see it? What if no one comes? Carter's jaw tightened. He found himself scanning the empty clearing as if looking for her, a woman who was just a ghost on a page. He saw the overturned boots near the tent. He imagined her sitting here, in this exact spot, writing these words, her hands shaking from cold and fear. He turned to the final page. The change was a physical shock. It was not the same handwriting. This was not writing at all. It was a wound on the paper, a frantic scrawl pressed so hard that the pen had torn through the page in places. The ink was smeared, as if by rain or tears. He had to squint to make out the words. Day 7. They saw it. They saw the SOS. A boat, not Coast Guard, just a boat. Washed up on the north side, looked like it was in trouble, too. 2 men. They looked at us. They looked cold. Carter's blood went from cold to ice. His pulse, which had been a low drum, suddenly spiked. The writing continued, sprawling across the bottom of the page, the last words jammed into the corner. They left, just left us here. Said they'd be back. But the way they looked at Evan, the way they looked at me. They aren't rescuers. They aren't rescuers. Oh God, they're coming back. The last 3 words were barely legible. Carter stared at them. Pooh, coming back. The world tilted. The damp, cold smell of the main forest was gone. Suddenly, his nostrils were filled with the fine, choking dust of the Kunar province. The year was 2011. It wasn't a memory. It was a sensation. The sudden, biting cold of a high desert night. The oppressive silence before an operation. The specific, metallic taste of fear that every soldier knows. The taste of adrenaline and stale water. He was on overwatch, lying on a ridge, the world a blurry green through his night vision. And he was waiting. He was waiting for the enemy to move. He was waiting for the trap to be sprung. It was the helplessness, the same helplessness that bled from Dolores's final words. He remembered the radio static in his ear, then the sudden chaotic burst of noise, the sharp cracking sounds of rifle fire erupting from the valley below. Then Adrian's voice, young, scared. "Carter, they're everywhere. We're pinned. I'm pinned." Carter remembered his own voice, screaming commands, trying to get a location, trying to direct fire. But he was on the ridge, 1,000 meters away. He was too far. He was helpless. "Adrian, talk to me. Where are you?" Silence. Then just a whisper over the hot mic. "Carter, they're coming back." A final burst of gunfire. Then nothing. Just the ringing in his ears and the sound of his own ragged breath echoing in the vast, cold dark. They had found Adrian 4 hours later. Carter had been the one to carry him. He had failed him. He, the team leader, the protector, had been helpless, and Adrian had died for it. Carter's hand clenched, his knuckles white. The cheap leather cover of the journal groaned in his grip. A sudden movement. Carter's head snapped up, his hand flying to his sidearm, pulling the weapon free in one smooth, practiced motion. His heart was a jackhammer against his ribs. Maverick. The dog had not moved. He was still standing watch, a perfect, unwavering sentinel. He had not sensed the ghosts. He was focused on the present. Carter let out a breath he didn't know he was holding. The smell of pine and salt rushed back in. He was in Maine. He was on the island. The dust of Afghanistan was gone. But the feeling remained. He looked down at the journal, at the last terrified words. He looked at the empty women's boots by the tent. Dolores, Evan. They were not strangers. They were not just a name on a page. They were Adrian. They were the mission he had failed, the promise he had broken. He had run to this empty coast, flown his ritualistic patterns, and surrounded himself with silence, all to escape that one feeling, the helplessness of that night in 2011. Now here it was again, but this time it was different. He was not on a ridge 1,000 meters away. He was here. He was on the ground. The people who wrote this journal, the ones who were terrified of the men who were coming back, they were his. He holstered his weapon. He carefully closed the journal, placing it with a tenderness he hadn't known he possessed into the dry bag at his side. It was no longer an intrusion. It was no longer a complication. It was personal. He stood up, his joints stiff from the cold rock. He looked at Maverick. The dog's head turned, his amber eyes meeting Carter's. Carter gave a single, sharp nod. The decision was made. He would not be helpless. He would not let another voice go silent. He would not fail again. Carter Hayes stood up, the stiffness in his knees a dull, distant ache. The cold from the granite boulder had seeped into him, but it was nothing compared to the ice-water clarity now flooding his veins. The journal was secure in his dry bag, its terrible, frantic last words seared into his mind. This was no longer a rescue mission. It was a recovery. And it was personal. He looked at Maverick. The dog was still holding his watch, a perfect model of disciplined patience. He had not moved from his spot, his body a rigid line, his gaze still fixed on the dark, narrow trail that led away from the opposite side of the clearing. That was the direction. The ripped tent flap, the overturned boots. They pointed to a violent, panicked exit, away from the beach, away from the trail they had used. It was the direction Dolores must have fled, or the direction they were taken. Carter moved to Maverick's side. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. He placed his left hand on the dog's harness, a firm, grounding pressure. With his right hand, he unholstered his Sig Sauer, the sound of the Kydex holster releasing the weapon, a soft, precise click. He held the pistol in a low-ready position, his finger resting outside the trigger guard. "Track," he whispered. It was the only word spoken. Maverick's entire body tensed for a brief second, acknowledging the command. Then he moved. He did not bound. He did not run. He moved like a gray-white shadow, his nose low to the ground, his paws making no sound on the carpet of pine needles. He was following a scent invisible to Carter, a trail of terror and desperation left hours or days before. Carter moved behind him, stepping where the dog stepped, his senses dialed to a level he hadn't touched in years. The soldier was fully awake now. The world was a 180-degree arc of responsibility. His eyes scanned the tree line, his ears strained against the crushing silence, listening for the snap of a twig, the scrape of a boot, the metallic sound of a weapon being readied. The silence of the island was no longer just eerie, it was hostile. It was a vacuum, waiting for a sudden violent noise to fill it. The trail here was not a trail. It was just a path of least resistance through the dense undergrowth. Branches, heavy with damp moss, snagged at his leather jacket. He pushed them aside, his gaze never wavering. He was focused on Maverick's tail, a steady, downward-curved plume. As long as the tail was steady, they were on the scent. They moved for 10 minutes, the campsite vanishing behind them, the sound of the ocean fading to a distant, ghostly sigh. They were deep in the island's interior now, a place of shadows and ancient, silent trees. Maverick stopped. He didn't just stop. He froze mid-stride, his left front paw raised, his head locked in place, his nose pointed at a spot just off the faint path. Carter stopped instantly, his heart a cold, heavy weight in his chest. He raised the pistol, his eyes scanning the area Maverick was indicating. He saw nothing, just a tangle of ferns and a large spruce tree. Maverick lowered his head, a low, anxious whine vibrating in his chest. He took a hesitant step toward the spruce, then looked back at Carter, his amber eyes wide. "What is it, boy?" Carter murmured, moving up to cover the dog. He saw it. It was not a natural feature. At the base of the spruce tree, there was a pile of dead branches and pine boughs, layered over a heap of dry leaves. It was wrong. The branches were too fresh, the breaks in the wood showing pale, fresh wounds. The leaves were dry, scooped from a different part of the forest floor, not belonging in this damp hollow. It was a pile, a deliberate, hastily constructed pile, about 3 feet long. Carter's blood ran cold. He had seen this before. This was a cache, or it was a grave. Maverick whined again, more insistently. He moved to the edge of the pile and began to dig, his front paws moving in a rapid scratching motion, throwing leaves and dirt behind him. He was not playing. He was urgent. This was the scent. "Hold, Mav," Carter commanded, his voice tight. The dog's urgency was a bad sign. "Hold." Maverick paused, panting, looking back at Carter. "I'll do it." Carter kept his pistol in his right hand, aimed at the dark woods, while he knelt with his left. He reached forward, pulling at the fresh-cut pine boughs. They came away easily, releasing a sharp, clean scent of resin that did nothing to cover the smell underneath. It was a damp, earthy smell mixed with something else, something coppery. He tossed the branches aside. Underneath was the pile of dry leaves. He swept them away with his forearm, his leather sleeve catching on the twigs. His gloved fingers brushed against fabric. His breath caught. He jammed his pistol back into its holster, kneading both hands. He dug his fingers into the damp earth beneath the leaves and pulled. It was not a body. He exhaled, a sharp, sudden rush of air. It was a piece of clothing. He pulled it free from the shallow depression. It was a man's jacket, a heavy, dark wool jacket, the kind a sailor or a fisherman would wear. It was soaked through with damp and dirt, but it was unmistakably a jacket. And it was stained. He laid it out on the ground. A large, dark, stiff stain covered the entire left shoulder and spread across the chest. There was no mistaking it. Even in the dim light of the forest, he could see the dark, oxidized color. It was blood. A lot of it. This was Evans. This was the wound Dolores had written about. This was the source of the blood on the knife. Carter knelt, staring at the jacket, his mind a sudden, cold engine of calculation. He processed the scene, and a new, terrible understanding settled over him. Fact 1. The campsite was a scene of pure, unadulterated panic. Overturned boots, a ripped tent, scattered gear. It was the picture of a sudden, chaotic attack. Fact 2. This jacket, the primary evidence of that attack, was not at the campsite. It was here, hundreds of yards away, deliberately hidden under a pile of freshly cut branches. The two facts were a contradiction. Panic and concealment are opposites. A panicked attacker, a smuggler surprised and angry, would have left the evidence. They would have acted with brutality and left. An animal would have dragged the body. But you do not hide evidence in a panic. You hide evidence when you have a plan. You hide evidence when you are worried about someone else finding it. You hide evidence when you are trying to control the narrative. This wasn't just an attack. This wasn't a crime of passion. This was a calculated act of concealment. The men from the boat, the ones Dolores was terrified of, were not just brutal. They were smart. They were methodical. They were still here, and they were covering their tracks. Carter stood up, the bloody mud-caked jacket still in his hand. He looked at Maverick. The dog was no longer digging. He was watching his partner, waiting for the next command. The game had changed. This was not a rescue mission for a badly injured man. This was an infiltration into hostile territory against an enemy who was thinking, planning, and waiting. An enemy who was, right now, somewhere on this small, silent, inescapable island with Dolores and Evan. The light was failing. It was not a gentle golden dusk, but a cold gray leaching of color from the world. The sun had dipped behind the western cliff face of the island, plunging the dense forest into a premature twilight. The air grew heavy and cold, the temperature dropping rapidly. Carter knelt in the gloom, the bloody wool jacket in his hands. The coppery smell of old blood was sharp in the damp air. He looked at the calculated concealment, then at the darkening woods around him. This was not a place to be at night. A tracker could work in the dark, but a man walking into a planned ambush could not. The rules had changed. "We're going back," he said, his voice a low rumble. He folded the jacket, Evan's jacket, and tucked it inside his own, against his chest. It was a cold, damp weight, a tangible piece of the puzzle. He would not leave it. "Heel," he commanded. Maverick, who had been patiently standing guard, moved instantly to Carter's left side, his shoulder brushing Carter's knee. They began the trek back to the campsite, a journey that felt 10 times longer than the one they had taken. Carter moved with a focused, silent intensity. The forest was no longer a place to be investigated. It was a place to be survived. Every shadow that pooled between the massive tree trunks was a potential hiding place. Every whisper of wind through the high pine boughs sounded like a man's breathing. His hand never left the grip of his pistol. Maverick was a mirror of his own tension. The dog's body was coiled, his head low, his ears swiveling, sampling the air. He was a 90-pound predator, and he was on high alert. It took them 20 minutes to reach the clearing, and by then the world was a deep, starless blue-black. The small camp was a pool of deeper shadows, the ripped tent a ghostly flapping shape. Carter's first priority was security. He could not return to the plane. It was too exposed on the water. This clearing, with its single trail, was a bad defensible position, but it was all they had. He gave Maverick a quiet command to take a watch post near the trail they had just left, and the dog disappeared into the darkness. Carter, meanwhile, did a slow, silent perimeter check. He found a spot against the same mossy boulder he had sat at earlier. It gave him a solid back and a clear view of the clearing and the 2 trails leading into it. He sat, the cold of the rock seeping through his jacket. He was used to the cold. He was used to the dark. He was used to the waiting. He listened. The island's oppressive silence had returned, now filled with the tiny rustling sounds of the night. He was cataloging them, sorting the natural from the unnatural, when Maverick reappeared. The dog did not bark. He simply materialized at Carter's side, a silent, gray-white shape. He pressed his cold, wet nose into Carter's hand, and then he growled. It was not the controlled, alert sound from the trail. This was a deep, chest-vibrating, throat-tearing sound. It was a threat. Maverick was not looking at the trail they had come from. He was staring at a dense patch of boulders and ferns on the far side of the clearing. Carter's hand was on his pistol. He raised it, pointing it into the darkness. "Who's there?" he commanded, his voice a low, hard bark that was designed to intimidate, to control. At first, there was only silence. Then, a human sound, a low, painful groan. "Stay back, Mav," Carter ordered. Maverick whined, his entire body quivering with a restrained, violent energy, but he held his position. "I said, who is there?" Carter called out, his voice louder. "Show yourself. Hands first." "Please." The voice was a cracked, desperate whisper. "Please, don't shoot. I'm hurt." A figure moved. It was a man, crawling, dragging himself from the shadows of the rocks. He was a dark shape, pulling himself along the ground with his arms, his left leg dragging uselessly behind him. He emerged into the faint residual light of the clearing, his hands held up, trembling. "Please," he panted, "help me." He was a man in his early 40s, his face pale and slick with sweat, his eyes wide with what looked like terror. He was wearing expensive, torn sailing gear. He saw Carter, a large, dark figure with a gun, and his eyes widened further. He flinched. No, please. Did they send you? Are they back?" Carter kept the pistol level. Maverick was now standing, his teeth bared, the growl a constant, menacing thrum. "Easy, Mav," Carter said, his voice firm. The dog quieted, but did not relax. "Who are you?" Carter asked. The man collapsed onto his side, his breath hitching in a sob. I'm Evan. My wife. Dolores. We were on the boat. Did you see her? Is she—" The name was a punch. Evan. It aligned perfectly with the journal. Carter's mind raced, trying to fit the pieces together. The man was performing. He had to be. "What happened?" Carter asked, his voice still hard, betraying no emotion. "Them," the man. "Evan," gasped, clutching his leg. "The other boat? Smugglers? I don't know. They found us. Yesterday. They were animals." His voice broke. They took Dolores. She tried to fight. And I think they killed her. He was sobbing now, a dry, racking sound. Carter's face was a mask. He believed none of it, but the performance was good. "And you?" Carter pressed. "I tried," the man choked out. "I tried to stop them. One of them, he had a knife. He stabbed me." He gestured wildly at his leg. I ran. I hid. I've been in the rocks. I heard you. I thought you were them, coming back to finish me. Please, you have to help me." Carter's gaze was cold. He was a soldier, and this man was a potential asset, a potential threat, or a victim. His training demanded he find out which. And despite his certainty that this was a lie, the memory of Adrian, the one he hadn't helped in time, was a spur. His duty for now was to treat the wounded. "Maverick, watch," he commanded. He holstered his weapon. The man flinched as Carter moved toward him, but Carter ignored it. He knelt, pulling the dry bag around. "I have a first aid kit." Thank you," the man, Vincent whispered, his eyes rolling. Carter pulled out his shears. "I need to see the wound." It hurts," Vincent moaned. "I'm cutting the pant leg." Carter's voice was flat. The shears made a sharp, ripping sound as they cut through the expensive, blood-soaked sailing pants. Carter pulled the fabric away, and he saw the wound. It was bad. A deep, vicious gash on the man's outer thigh. It was a laceration, just as he'd said. It was not a gunshot. It was a knife wound. But it was the rest of the scene that screamed at Carter. The man was not bleeding out. The blood flow was sluggish. And around the wound, there was a clear, sharp line of demarcation in the caked blood, the impression of a bandage that had been tied very tightly, and for a long time. The wound itself, while deep, had been partially cleaned. Carter's field experience, his tactical medical training, screamed at him. This was not the wound of a man who had been stabbed, ran, and hid in terror. This was not a wound that had been left to bleed out for the past 24 hours. If it had, the man would be dead from blood loss or in deep hypovolemic shock. This man was coherent. He was articulate. He was performing. This wound had been dressed. It had been bandaged hours ago, and the man had only just now taken the bandage off, or perhaps it had fallen off to make the scene more dramatic. I tried to stop it, Vincent moaned as if reading his mind. I used a piece of my shirt. Carter's eyes were cold. He met the man's gaze. Hold still, he said. This is going to sting. He uncapped the bottle of antiseptic from his kit. He didn't just dab it. He poured it directly into the open wound. The man's reaction was immediate and explosive. He let out a piercing shriek, his entire body arching off the ground. It was a genuine, agonizing scream. At that moment, Carter knew two things for certain. One, the wound was absolutely real and agonizingly painful. Two, the man was lying about everything else. Carter looked up from his work. Across the clearing, Maverick had not relaxed. The dog stood, his lips curled back in a silent, unwavering snarl. He was not looking at a victim. He was looking at an enemy. Vincent's shriek had been genuine, a raw sound of agony that had echoed off the granite cliffs and then vanished into the trees, leaving the clearing in a stunned, ringing silence. Carter pulled his hands back. The antiseptic had done its job. He worked quickly now, his hands moving with a medic's impersonal efficiency. He packed the laceration with sterile gauze and wrapped it tightly with a pressure bandage from his kit. The bleeding was controlled. Vincent was panting, his face pale and slick, his eyes shut tight. It, he gasped. It's done, Carter said, his voice flat. He repacked his medkit. The man was a liar. The man was also in real, undeniable pain. The two facts existed together, a dangerous combination. He couldn't leave him here, not because he trusted him, but because he couldn't. Leaving a wounded man in the dark, even a lying one, was a tactical liability. A man in that much pain would make noise, attract whatever else was on this island. And Carter needed to watch him. He was the only link, the only piece of the puzzle that was still breathing. Can you walk? Carter asked. Vincent tried to push himself up, but his face went ashen, and he fell back with a groan. No, I can't. We're moving to the campsite. It's too exposed here. Carter's mind was working. He needed an open, observable space. He needed to keep this man in his sight line. We can use the tent for a windbreak. It'll be warmer. It was a lie, but it was a logical one. Vincent nodded, his teeth chattering. Whether from cold or shock, Carter didn't care. Getting him there was a brutal 10-minute ordeal. Carter was not gentle. He hauled Vincent to his feet, the man's arm draped over Carter's shoulders. Vincent tried to put weight on his good leg, hopping and dragging his injured one, his breath hissing through his teeth with every small movement. Maverick shadowed them, a gray-white ghost in the darkness, his body low, his suspicion a palpable force. They reached the tattered clearing. Carter deposited Vincent near the cold fire pit, propping him against the same log Dolores had used as a bench. Stay here, Carter ordered. He didn't wait for a reply. He moved to his boulder, his chosen overwatch position. He needed a fire, not for warmth, but for light. A small, controlled, tactical fire. Just enough to see by. He used his knife and a magnesium stick, shaving off small, hot sparks into a ball of dry tinder he'd gathered. A small, smokeless flame caught, licked, and grew. The fire cast a small, flickering circle of orange light, pushing the oppressive, absolute darkness back by a few feet. It made the ripped tent and the scattered, abandoned gear look like a stage set for a tragedy. Carter sat, his back against the solid rock, his legs crossed, his pistol resting on his thigh. He was comfortable. He had spent half his life in positions just like this, cold, tired, and waiting for an enemy to move. He tossed a foil-wrapped MRE ration bar across the fire. It landed softly in Vincent's lap. Vincent flinched, startled. He looked down at the bar, then at Carter. Thank you. Eat, Carter said. It wasn't a suggestion. Vincent fumbled with the wrapper, his hands shaking. He took a small bite, chewing with difficulty. He looked from Carter, a silent dark shape against the rock, to Maverick. The dog had not settled. He was not lying down. He was not sniffing the perimeter. He was sitting. He sat just at the edge of the firelight, a perfect sphinx-like silhouette, his head up, his ears forward, his amber eyes reflecting the small flame. And he was staring. He was staring directly at Vincent. Vincent, trying to bridge the gap, trying to build the rapport of a fellow victim, tore off a small piece of the ration bar. He held it out, his voice a coo. "Here, boy," Vincent said. "Good dog. You hungry?" Maverick did not move. He did not growl. He did not even look at the food. His gaze remained locked on Vincent's face. "He's a good boy, right?" Vincent said, his voice a strained, pathetic attempt at friendship. He tossed the piece of food. It landed on the dirt in front of the dog. Maverick's reaction was absolute. He did not sniff it. He did not acknowledge it. He simply kept his eyes on Vincent, as if the food and the man were beneath his notice. After a moment, he deliberately turned his head, just slightly, away from the offering. It was a snub, a profound animalistic gesture of pure contempt. Vincent's hand, still outstretched, slowly lowered. He looked at the dog, then at Carter. Carter's face was a shadow, unreadable. He's well-trained," Vincent said, his voice small. He quickly ate the rest of his bar. The night dragged on. The psychological battle was silent, fought in the space of that small, flickering fire. Carter did not sleep. He knew how. He would close his eyes for 5, 10 seconds at a time, a tactical rest, but his senses remained sharp. He let the silence do the work. Eventually, Vincent couldn't stand it. This island," Vincent whispered, his voice raspy. It's a terrible place. You're not from around here, are you?" Carter stared into the fire. He said nothing. I can't believe Dolores is gone," Vincent continued, his voice catching. "She was everything. Those men. They were monsters. I hope you find them. I hope you—" Carter cut him off, his voice a low, flat rumble, not even looking at him. "You should get some rest. We'll move at first light." He was not asking questions. He was not engaging. He was observing. He was watching the man's pupils in the firelight, the cadence of his faked grief, the way he clutched his very real wound for emphasis. Vincent, rebuffed, eventually fell silent. He leaned his head back against the log, his breathing becoming shallow, his eyes closing. He let out a few theatrical, pain-filled moans before settling into a fitful, shallow sleep, his face turned toward the fire. But Carter knew he wasn't asleep. He was a predator, just like Carter, and he was just waiting. And all through the long, cold hours, Maverick did not sleep. The dog did not lie down. He did not circle. He sat upright, a sentinel of gray and white. He was a living lie detector, and he had not moved from his post. He was a statue of judgment, his gaze unwavering, his breath a low, steady huff in the cold. He was guarding his partner. The sky began to turn from black to a deep, bruised purple. The first cold light of dawn was minutes away. Vincent stirred. He woke with a pained groan, blinking his eyes as if coming out of a deep sleep. He looked at the fire, now just a pile of white ash and glowing embers. He looked at Carter, who sat in the same position as before. And then he looked at Maverick. The dog was still staring at him. Vincent, perhaps in a moment of frustration, or perhaps one last desperate attempt to prove he was a harmless victim, tried again. "Good boy," Vincent whispered, his voice thick. "You've been watching all night. Good dog." He slowly, theatrically, reached out his hand, palm up, to pet the dog. He extended his arm across the small, dead fire pit. Maverick's reaction was the final unspoken word. He did not growl. He did not snap. He did not even bare his teeth. He simply stood up. He rose to his feet with a silent, fluid grace. He took 3 deliberate steps, his claws making no sound on the hard-packed earth. He walked past the dead fire, past Vincent's outstretched, trembling hand, and he sat down. He sat directly between Vincent and Carter. He faced Vincent. His body was a solid, living shield, his shoulders broad, his head high. He did not look at Carter. He did not need to. The message was as clear as a gunshot. "You will not touch him. You will not get to him. I am between you, and I am watching." Vincent's hand froze in midair. He stared at the dog's broad, furry back. The contempt was absolute, a physical rejection. He slowly, very slowly, pulled his hand back, clenching it into a fist at his side. Carter watched the entire exchange. The fire had died, and in the gray, cold light of the new day, he could see Vincent's face clearly for the first time. The mask of the grieving victim was gone. In its place, just for a second, was a flash of cold, hard fury. Carter's training had told him the man was lying. Maverick had just confirmed it. The gray dawn light was cruel. It offered no warmth, only a stark, unforgiving illumination that exposed the cold reality of the clearing. The fire was a circle of white ash. The tattered tent was a monument to old terror, and the man and the dog were a portrait of absolute distrust. Carter Hayes stood up. The movement was a sharp, cracking sound in the silence, his joints stiff and protesting from a night spent sitting on cold stone. He was a dark, formidable shape in the new light, his face a mask of weary resolve. Vincent, who had been feigning a pained, fitful sleep, opened his eyes. His victim mask was back in place, but it was thinner now. His eyes, though clouded with pretend exhaustion, were sharp. They darted from Carter to the dog and back. What time is it?" Vincent asked, his voice a dry rasp. Is she—" Carter ignored the question. He walked to the edge of the clearing and retrieved his dry bag. "I'm going to the plane," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that offered no room for conversation. "The plane?" Vincent struggled to sit up, hissing as his injured leg took the movement. Is it time? Are we leaving?" "The morning air is different," Carter said, the lie coming easily. "Denser. Sometimes the signal skips off the atmosphere better at dawn. I'm going to try the radio again." He let the lie hang in the air. No signal, no rescue. This was a logic Vincent's character was forced to accept. "Yes," he said, nodding, the relief in his voice just a little too polished. "Yes, of course. Try the radio, please. We have to get off this island." "I'm leaving you water," Carter said. He walked over and dropped a plastic bottle of water and one of his foil-wrapped ration bars on the ground, well out of Vincent's reach, forcing him to move for it. "Don't leave this clearing. Don't light a fire. Don't do anything." It was a command, not a piece of advice. I can't," Vincent said, gesturing to his heavily bandaged leg. "I'll be right here. Please, just hurry." Carter turned, his leather jacket groaning softly in the cold. "Maverick? Heal?" The word was a release. Maverick, who had been a statue of contempt all night, finally broke his stare. He stood, shook his entire body once, a violent rattling sound of fur and muscle, as if to shake off the man's very presence. He moved instantly to Carter's left side, his shoulder brushing his partner's thigh. Carter turned and walked out of the clearing, down the path toward the beach. He did not look back. He did not need to. He could feel Vincent's eyes on his back, a hot, calculating pressure. And he could feel Maverick at his side, a silent, living radar, his rear guard. If Vincent had tried to move, if a branch had so much as snapped behind them, Maverick would have reacted before Carter's brain even registered the sound. They walked for 200 yards, the path damp and soft underfoot, the sounds of the camp fading, replaced by the distant rhythmic sigh of the ocean. Then, out of sight and earshot, Carter stopped. He stood for a full minute, just breathing. He had been in guard mode for 10 hours, a static defensive posture. Now he needed to hunt. He needed to find the truth, the one that was not sitting back in that clearing. He needed to find Dolores and Evan. He looked down. Maverick was looking up at him, his amber eyes bright, intelligent, and questioning. He was waiting for the real command. "Okay, Mav," Carter said, his voice low. He reached down and scrubbed the dog's thick ruff, his gloved fingers digging into the fur. "No more games." He stepped off the path into the dense, dark woods, pushing past a curtain of wet spruce branches. He was no longer going to the beach. That was a lie for a liar. He pointed, not in a specific direction, but into the vast unknown interior of the island. "Find," he said. The command was everything. It was not track, it was not heal, it was find. Find the missing, find the danger, find the scent that did not belong. Maverick's entire demeanor changed in an instant. He was no longer a guard, he was a hunter. His nose dropped to the damp earth, and he began to cast back and forth, snorting, pulling the air into his lungs, tasting the complex map of the island. He ignored the trail they had been on. He ignored the scent of Carter. He ignored the lingering sour sweat and fierce smell of Vincent that had contaminated the camp. He was looking for something new. And he found it. His head snapped up. He took a few quick steps to his right, toward the spine of the granite ridge that formed the center of the island. His nose went down. His tail, which had been low and cautious, went straight out, rigid. He had it. Maverick moved, and Carter followed. This was not a trail. This was a brutal, vertical climb. Carter used his hands, pulling himself up over moss-slicked rocks and weaving through tangled ancient roots. Maverick was a ghost, moving with an effortless four-legged drive efficiency, pausing every few yards to let his partner catch up, his nose always working. Carter was not an indoor man, but the climb left him breathing heavily, the cold air burning his lungs. He was trusting the dog completely, putting his life in Maverick's paws. They climbed for 15 minutes, ascending the ridge. As they got higher, the wind changed. The thick, damp smell of the forest floor was peeled away by a sharp, cold wind coming off the open ocean, and it brought a new smell with it. Carter caught it at the same time Maverick did. The dog stopped on a high ledge, his nose high in the air, sniffing, confirming. Carter smelled it too. Faint, but undeniable. It was not pine, it was not salt. It was not the organic decay of the forest. It was a chemical bite, acrid and poisoning. It was the unmistakable, greasy tang of diesel fuel. And underneath it, just as the summary had suggested, was the sour animal smell of old sweat and the faint, stale odor of tobacco. This was it. This was the other boat. The one from the journal. The one Dolores had seen. The one Vincent had not mentioned. Maverick let out a single, low, woof, a sound of confirmation and urgency. He was pulling now, the scent strong in his nostrils. They crested the ridge. The wind up here was a physical force, screaming past Carter's ears, whipping his hair. From here, he could see the ocean, but it was not the calm, gray water of his cove. This was the north side of the island, a wild, churning expanse of white-capped waves. Maverick was already moving, leading him down a steep, treacherous game trail, his paws dislodging small stones that went rattling down into the abyss. The sound of the ocean grew from a sigh to a roar. This was not the gentle lapping of the beach. This was the harsh, crashing sound of waves smashing against sheer rock. They descended, the smell of diesel now so strong it was almost nauseating. The trail ended abruptly at a sheer 50-foot drop, a narrow ledge of rock. Carter stopped, his hand grabbing Maverick's harness to keep him from going over. He looked down. It was a different cove, a hidden cove, just as the summary had foretold. It was a jagged black rock inlet, a natural trap, almost invisible from the sea. And down there, tucked against the rocks, listing to one side, battered by the surf, was a boat. It was an old, ugly motor yacht, perhaps 40 feet long, its paint scarred, its engine silent. It was the source of the diesel. It was the lair. The roar of the North Atlantic was a physical assault. Carter Hayes lay flat on the granite ridge, the wind tearing at his jacket, his eyes watering from the cold and the sting of the salt spray. 50 feet below, in the jagged black rock cove, the battered motor yacht was a prisoner. Waves, white and angry, smashed against its hull, making the entire vessel groan and scrape against the rocks it was clearly grounded on. Maverick was beside him, his body pressed low to the stone, his gray-white fur whipped by the wind. The dog's ears were flat against his head, but his nose was still working, pulling in the overwhelming acrid smell of diesel fuel. This was the lair. Carter scanned the cliff face. It was a sheer 50-foot drop, but it was not smooth. It was fractured, ancient granite, full of crevices and small ledges. To his right, a narrow chimney, a deep crack in the rock, looked like a treacherous but possible path down. This was not a choice. He had to go. "Mav!" he shouted over the wind, his voice snatched away. He didn't need to shout. He pointed to the dog, then to himself, then to the path. "Easy. Stay close." The descent was a controlled fall. Carter went first, his boots finding impossible, toe-sized holds in the rock. His gloved fingers, numb and stiff, gripped the cold, wet stone. He moved with a ranger's economy, testing every hold, his body light, his mind focused only on the next 3 feet. Maverick was right behind him, a four-legged miracle of agility. The dog moved with instinctive animal grace, his claws finding purchase where Carter's boot slipped, his body low and balanced. A piece of rock broke loose under Carter's boot. He slipped, his body lurching, but his left hand held. A small cascade of pebbles went rattling down to the beach, a sound completely swallowed by the crashing waves. He froze, his heart hammering, but no one on the boat below reacted. He regained his footing and continued. It took 5 agonizing minutes, but they reached the bottom. The beach was not sand, but a treacherous field of black, algae-slicked stones, the size of fists. The motor yacht was 30 yards away. It was old, maybe from the 1980s, its white and blue paint scarred and peeling. It was beached hard, its stern tilted up onto the rocks. And it was not abandoned. Even over the roar of the surf, Carter heard it, a sharp, metallic clinking sound. It was followed by a loud, muffled curse, a growl of pure frustration. Carter signaled Maverick, a flat, downward-slicing motion of his hand. Quiet. Maverick instantly froze, sinking into the shadows of the cliff wall. Carter moved, his feet silent on the wet stones, timing his steps with the rhythmic crash and retreat of the waves. He slipped from one large boulder to the next, closing the distance. He saw the source of the noise. On the aft deck of the boat, a large, burly man in a stained, grease-covered jacket was hunched over the open engine compartment. This was Sawyer. He was holding a large wrench, and he looked furious. He hit the engine block with the side of the tool, another loud, clanging sound. "Piece of junk," Sawyer growled, his voice a low bark that the wind carried to Carter. Sawyer was distracted. He was angry. He was focused on the engine. This was the moment. Carter was about to move to find a way to board when he froze again. He heard another sound. It was not the wind. It was not Sawyer. It was not the waves. It was a low, rhythmic thump, thump, thump. It was muffled. It was coming from inside the boat. Someone was kicking a bulkhead. Someone was alive. The entire mission's parameters snapped into a new, sharp focus. This was no longer just a hunt. It was a hostage rescue. And Carter Hayes knew with absolute certainty what to do. He looked at Maverick. He gave the stay signal, a simple, open-palmed gesture. The dog did not move, his body coiled like a spring, his eyes locked on his partner. Carter moved from the shadow of the rocks, his pistol drawn but held low. The waves covered his approach. He reached the stern. The boat rocked violently as a wave hit it, the movement disorienting. Sawyer cursed again, bracing himself against the engine. His back was to Carter. Carter climbed onto the deck. His boots made no sound. He was 3 feet behind Sawyer. He did not use the gun. A shot would echo, a signal of his presence. He needed this man silent. He moved. He dropped the gun back into its holster. In one fluid, brutal motion, his left arm wrapped around Sawyer's thick neck, his forearm cinching tight against the man's throat. His right hand locked onto the back of Sawyer's head, completing the blood choke. Sawyer's reaction was immediate. A huge, panicked grunt. His body arched, his thick arms flailing, dropping the heavy wrench with a loud metallic clatter onto the deck. He kicked back, but Carter had his balance, his center of gravity low. Sawyer's hands clawed at Carter's arm, but the hold was perfect. It was not about air. It was about pressure. 10 seconds. Sawyer's struggles weakened. 12 seconds. His body went limp. Carter held for 3 more seconds, then gently eased the unconscious man to the deck. He was alive, but he was out. Carter found a length of nylon rope in a deck locker and hog-tied Sawyer's hands and feet, his movements quick, his knots professional. The thumping inside the cabin was frantic now. They had heard the wrench fall. Carter turned to the companionway hatch. It was closed, and it was padlocked, a heavy brass lock from the outside. He looked around. Sawyer's toolbox was open. He grabbed a short, heavy crowbar. He jammed it between the hasp and the wood, put his full weight on it, and wrenched. The wood splintered with a sharp cracking sound, and the lock tore free. He ripped the door open. The stench that rolled out was a physical blow, a sickening mix of diesel, saltwater, mildew, and human waste. "Maverick, with me," Carter commanded. The dog was on the deck in a flash, bounding down the dark steps ahead of him. Carter followed, his pistol drawn, his tactical flashlight cutting a bright white beam into the darkness. "Hello," a woman's voice screamed, muffled. "Please, help us." The main cabin was a disaster, tables and chairs overturned from the storm. Maverick was already at a door in the forward bulkhead, scratching at it frantically, whining. Carter didn't hesitate. He kicked the door. It was flimsy wood and splintered open. He shone the light inside, and his blood ran cold. They were huddled in the darkness of the small triangular V-berth, cowering from the light. A man and a woman. Their mouths were sealed with duct tape. Their hands and feet were bound with zip ties. The woman was Dolores. Her eyes, wide and terrified above the tape, were the same eyes he had imagined when he read her journal. The man beside her was Evan, the real Evan. He was pale, his face slick with sweat, his body shivering violently. A high fever. His leg was stretched out, a crude, bloody bandage wrapped around his calf. "I'm here to help," Carter said, his voice softer than he intended. He holstered his pistol and pulled out his knife. Maverick was already there, pushing his head into Dolores's bound hands, whining, licking the tears from her face. Carter cut the tape from Dolores's mouth first. She gasped, a ragged, desperate lungful of air, then burst into sobs. "Evan, my husband! Save Evan!" Carter sliced through her bonds, then moved to Evan. He cut the tape. The man's skin was burning hot. He was barely conscious. "It's okay," Dolores was sobbing, clinging to Carter's arm. "It's okay. Who are you? Did you—" "My name is Carter Hayes. I saw your SOS. I read your journal." He cut Evan's last bond. "We need to get you out of here. The other man, the one who was at your camp. His name is Vincent." The truth tumbled out of Dolores, her words fast and frantic, tripping over each other in a rush of terror and relief. "Yes, Vincent. Their boat crashed in the storm, just like ours. They found us at the camp." "What did they want?" Carter asked, his mind piecing it together. They had cargo," she whispered, her eyes wide. "Bags, dark, heavy bags. They wanted our supplies. They wanted, I don't know." Evan himself whispered, his voice a dry, feverish rasp. "Evan fought. He tried to protect me." "He's an engineer," Dolores said, grabbing her husband's hand. "He's strong. He fought back, while Vincent was hurting me." Evan grabbed a tool from his bag, a sharp metal file, and he stabbed him. He stabbed Vincent in the leg, right in the calf. Carter froze. The wound, the laceration. "They were going to kill us," Dolores cried, her voice rising. "Sawyer, the big one. He had a rope. They were tying us up. And then we heard it." "Heard what?" Carter asked, his voice tight. "Your plane," Evan whispered, his eyes fluttering. "We heard your engine, far away, but we heard it. And Vincent, he stopped. He looked up at the sky." Dolores nodded, her face a mask of horrified memory. "He looked at his leg, at the blood, then he looked at Sawyer. He told Sawyer to hide them and keep them quiet. He said, I have an idea. That signal. It's not a trap. It's an opportunity." And then he just ran. He ran toward the beach, toward your sound. We've been here ever since. We thought we were going to die here. The entire sickening, brilliant deception snapped into place. The victim, the performance, the stab wound he'd gotten from the smugglers. It was all a lie. A masterful, terrible improvisation built on a foundation of real, agonizing pain. And the man who had performed it, Vincent, was back at the camp, armed, waiting, and now he would be wondering where Carter had gone. The air in the V-berth was thick and toxic, but Carter's voice cut through the panic. "We have to move, now!" Dolores was in shock, her hands fluttering, her sobs catching in her throat. But Evan, the real Evan, though weak and burning with fever, heard the command in Carter's voice. He was a survivor. He nodded, his eyes grim. "Help me up," Evan rasped. Carter didn't hesitate. He pulled the man's arm over his shoulder, taking his full weight. "Maverick, point," he commanded. The dog was already up the steps, a gray shadow in the dark companionway. They emerged onto the deck. The wind was still howling. The unconscious, hog-tied form of Sawyer was where Carter had left him. Dolores gasped and flinched away, but Carter just pulled Evan toward the cliff. "We climb," he said. The next 30 minutes were a nightmare of brutal vertical physics. The 50-foot climb up the chimney, which had been treacherous for Carter alone, was nearly impossible with a wounded, feverish man. Carter was a machine. He pushed Evan up onto a ledge, then climbed past him, reached down, and hauled him up by his harness. Dolores, fueled by a terror that had burned away her shock, scrambled ahead of them, her fingers raw, her breath sobbing in the wind. Maverick was the first one to the top, and he immediately took a defensive position, scanning their back trail, his body low, his ears pinned back against the wind. When Carter finally hauled Evan over the lip of the ridge, they all collapsed, panting, on the wind-blasted granite. We can't," Dolores panted. "We can," Carter said. He stood, his own legs shaking with exhaustion. He looked back in the direction of the camp. He knows we're not with him. He's coming." That was all the motivation they needed. The journey back across the island's spine was a desperate, lurching race against time. Evan was a dead weight, but he was trying, his feet dragging, his body held up between Carter and Dolores. Maverick ranged ahead, then back, a frantic, silent perimeter, his nose tasting the wind, his eyes scanning the dense woods. Then they saw it. Through a break in the trees, the placid gray water of the South Cove. And floating on it, a beautiful, impossible sight, the red and white Cessna. They stumbled down the final path, the one Carter had first taken. They burst from the trees onto the small, quiet beach. "Get him in," Carter ordered. It was an awkward, clumsy process. They waded through the shallow, icy water. Carter and Dolores maneuvered Evan onto the float, then into the cabin, laying him flat across the two rear seats. Dolores scrambled in after him, her hands immediately going to her husband's face, whispering his name. Carter slid into the pilot's seat. Maverick leapt in beside him, shaking the cold water from his fur. Carter's hand went to the ignition key. But first, he grabbed the radio handset. He didn't know why. The dead zone. The cliffs. It had been useless, but he had to try. "Mayday, mayday, mayday," he said, his voice low and urgent, not expecting a reply. "This is Cessna November 5185 Kilo at Moose Call Island, South Cove." A burst of static, and then, 85 Kilo, this is United States Coast Guard Bar Harbor Station. I read you. What is your situation? The voice was a miracle. It was calm, professional, and authoritative. Carter felt a wave of relief so profound his knees almost buckled. It had worked. The atmosphere, the time of day, a simple act of grace. It didn't matter. "Bar Harbor, this is 85 Kilo, Carter said, his voice steady. "I have 2 rescued civilians, one in critical condition with a fever and a leg wound. I have 2 hostiles on the island. One is secured on the north side. The second is at large, armed and dangerous. "Understood, 85 Kilo," the voice came back. "This is Commander Spencer. We have a Jayhawk helicopter spinning up right now. Can you provide a sit rep on the second hostile?" "Negative, Bar Harbor. He is the man who faked the—" "Wait." Carter's words cut off. "Maverick?" The dog was not looking at Carter. He was not looking at the radio. He was staring, rigid, at the beach, at the dark opening of the trail. A low, vicious, terrifying sound was vibrating from the dog's chest, a growl so deep it was almost felt rather than heard. "No," Dolores whispered from the back, her voice a thin thread of new terror. A figure emerged from the woods. It was Vincent. He was a nightmare. The mask of the victim was gone, replaced by a contorted face of pure animalistic rage. He was limping, dragging his bandaged leg, but he was moving with a terrible, focused speed. In his right hand, he held a dark, snub-nosed pistol. "You!" he screamed, his voice a raw, broken sound. He was on the beach, 20 yards away, wading into the shallows. You left me!" He raised the pistol. He was aiming at Carter, a clear shot through the windscreen. Carter's own pistol was holstered, trapped by his seatbelt. He was a sitting duck. "Carter!" Dolores screamed. Vincent's hand steadied. He was taking aim. "Maverick!" Carter's voice was low, a single, sharp command. "Get him!" The dog did not need to be told twice. He was a gray and white blur. He launched from the co-pilot seat, over Carter's lap, out the open door, and onto the float. In a single explosive movement, he hit the water. Vincent saw the attacking animal. His aim wavered, shifting from Carter to the dog. A sharp, flat crack echoed off the cliffs as the gun went off. The bullet went wide, striking the water in a harmless white splash. Maverick didn't even flinch. He crossed the shallow water in 3 massive bounds. Vincent tried to aim again, but he was too late. Maverick did not go for the gun arm. He did not go for the throat. He knew exactly what to do. He slammed his 90-pound body at full speed directly into Vincent's injured left leg. The sound was not a gunshot. It was a heavy, wet, sickening sound, followed by a high, thin scream that was not human. Vincent's leg, already torn and battered, could not take the impact. It buckled instantly. Vincent collapsed into the shallows, his body folding like a puppet, the gun flying from his nerveless fingers and sinking into the gray water. He landed in a heap, clutching his leg, his screams now just agonized, animalistic sobs. Maverick stood over him, chest heaving, teeth bared, a low growl rolling from him. He did not bite. He did not need to. The threat was neutralized. Carter was out of the plane, his own gun in hand, wading through the water. He kicked Vincent's pistol deeper into the mud. He looked at the man, who was now just a pathetic, broken thing, whimpering in the surf. Then he heard it. A deep thudding sound that was not his own engine. A sound that grew louder, beating against the cliffs. A U.S. Coast Guard Jayhawk helicopter, painted bright orange and white, appeared over the southern ridge. It was fast. It settled onto the small beach in a deafening whirlwind of sand and prop wash. The side door slid open. Medics and armed Coast Guard personnel deployed. A man in a crisp uniform in his 50s, with sharp, intelligent eyes, jumped down and strode toward Carter. "Commander Spencer," he said, not offering a hand, just assessing. "Carter Hayes," Carter replied, holstering his weapon. "He's the second hostile. His partner, Sawyer, is on the north side in a beached motor yacht. He's incapacitated." "We'll get him," Spencer said. His eyes went from Carter to the dog, who was now calmly sitting at Carter's side. "You did good work, Mr. Hayes." Medics were already at the plane, carefully easing Evan onto a stretcher. Dolores climbed out, her face a mask of tears and relief. She ran to Carter and threw her arms around him, her body shaking. "Thank you," she sobbed. "Thank you." Carter froze. It was a contact he was not used to. He awkwardly patted her on the back. "They'll take care of you," he said. He and Maverick stepped back as the summary had promised. They watched the medics work with efficient, calm precision. They watched them load Evan into the helicopter. Dolores climbed in, never letting go of her husband's hand. She looked back at Carter, her eyes saying more than her words ever could. The helicopter lifted off, its rotor wash tearing at Carter's jacket. The bad guys were secured by the remaining Coast Guard crew. And then it was quiet. The island was silent again, save for the wind. Carter stood on the beach, the cold wind chilling his damp clothes. He was alone again, just him and his dog. He had expected the old familiar hollowness to return, the emptiness of a mission over, the cold ache of his self-imposed solitude. But it didn't come. He watched the helicopter become a small black dot against the clearing sky. He thought of Dolores and Evan, safe. He thought of the journal. He thought of Adrian. This time, he had been there. This time, he had not been helpless. He was still alone, here on this empty beach. But for the first time in years, the solitude didn't feel heavy. It didn't feel like a punishment. It just was. Maverick nudged his cold, wet nose into Carter's hand. Carter looked down at him. "Let's go home, Mav." He untied his plane. He climbed in. Maverick took his seat, his fur already drying. Carter started the engine. The familiar deafening roar filled the cabin. The shield. He took off, climbing out of the cove, the gray-green island shrinking behind him. He banked the Cessna, pointing its nose toward the mainland, toward home. He reached over and rested his hand on Maverick's head. The dog leaned into the touch, a low, contented sound in his chest. The engine was still loud. It was still a wall of sound. But the silence inside Carter, the one he had always been running from, the one that had always been filled with the echoes of his past, was different. It was no longer an escape. It was peace, reclaimed. The story of Carter and Maverick reminds us that true loyalty, the kind that never asks questions, can be an anchor in the stormiest of seas. It shows us that even when we feel lost in the echoes of the past, a brave and faithful heart can guide us back to the present, helping us find the peace we thought was gone. If that bond resonates with you, we invite you to become part of our community. Your support by subscribing, liking, and sharing this story allows us to keep these tales alive. We would be truly honored to read your own reflections in the comments below. And the journey doesn't have to end here. Our newest story is now on the screen, waiting for you.